This is an oration about voices, and specifically about Indigenous voices from the past 5 generations, those dear elders, as Lou Bennett just called them. It's offered with some trepidation as a non-Indigenous Australian. I do not presume to understand the world of these Indigenous speakers, but in this lecture I do hope to call up some voices from the past century as they talk about survival and identity and community. My academic specialty, as you just heard, is the intellectual history of public policy, how policy ideas evolve and change over time. And that's an analysis that relies in the end on the words of the thinkers, the people who've done the work. And tonight I want to focus on a group of those, all Indigenous. Public policy is very often a conversation across generations as people grapple with the same questions, generation after generation, decades apart, but they're all trying to do the same thing. They're trying to learn from the past and think about the future. Such policy conversations are rarely straightforward. The language changes, ideas are expressed in the idiom of the moment, concepts vanish and they need to be rediscovered. There's never a single thread to the conversation. What there are multiple strands, overlapping, intertwining, responding to events, and yet returning to just a handful of the same subjects. And I want to suggest that the past century of Indigenous dialogue includes many traditions, some framed around rights, some framed around land, some demanding equality, others separation, all seeking answers and arguing and shifting and never settling. And I hope to explore just 5 of these strands, these conversations, each from a different generation and moment in Indigenous history, and to see how ideas have flowed across generations so that successive Indigenous leaders grapple with the same questions and bring their own take to those questions. And I want to start in 1938 and end in the here and now. We begin and we will close on Yorta Yorta country, but we'll traverse all too briefly discussions from across the continent. And the aim is not to judge, it's to honour Indigenous policy thinking about identity and engagement with settler society. I want to start in 1938 with Lou Bennett's great-great-uncle, William Cooper. It's 1938, 150 years since European settlement, which brought, of course, dislocation, disease and dispersal. And that European settlement shaped the life of William Cooper, born around 1860 near the intersection of the Murray and the Goulburn Rivers, a proud Yorta Yorta man, who from childhood worked as a shearer and a handyman in regional Victoria and sometimes in New South Wales. He took adult literacy classes during his years at the Moira Station under the tutelage of a missionary, Daniel Matthews. And as he studied and mulled, Cooper began writing letters and petitions to political figures, so that when he was about 27, he petitioned Baron Charles Carrington, the Governor of New South Wales, on behalf of local Indigenous people. And his argument was simple: give us access to traditional land. Let families have around 100 acres so that they could develop them, and do so not only because it will provide self-sufficiency, but because Aborigines, as he said, were the former occupiers of the land. Now, this is hardly the first call for the displaced, from the displaced for land, but Cooper had been thinking carefully about the legal framework for the colony. He argued that the British and their descendants had an obligation to Aboriginal people who had suffered violent dispossession. Indeed, he believed that Queen Victoria had granted the reserve lands to those Aboriginal people living on them. When next he put the case, Cooper had expanded his argument. A committed Christian, he used the teaching of the missionary. God and religion represented a higher form of authority, he said, a principle that establishes rights for all people. And so he argued again for land. And these arguments were rebuffed, but Cooper, a little like Paul Briggs, never gave up. As he aged, he thought deeply about assimilation and separation. He sought ways for these two worlds to coexist. In a letter to The Age in 1933, he again presented the case for access to land, arguing that self-reliance would encourage different people to live side by side. It is against the nature of the Aborigine, he said, to move from his home country, and he should be well cared for in his natural environment. Again in 1937, Cooper argued for a partnership so that Aboriginal identity could flourish alongside the European society that surrounded Aboriginal Australia. And this, he suggested, was an urgent national project. A project that belonged, he argued, to the Commonwealth of Australia. This is one of the first voices to say Canberra, the Commonwealth, has a responsibility for Indigenous affairs. An argument he's making before the Commonwealth has any power to do anything. So he's a long way ahead of the argument here. And he's saying we need to be partners in the work of our country. And the only vehicle that makes that possible is the national government, the Commonwealth of Australia. Cooper, when the time Cooper wrote this, he was now a city dweller, because in his 70s he'd left Kamlagunja and moved to Footscray in Melbourne. And he did so because he couldn't be guaranteed the old age pension if he stayed on the station. He had to move into the city in order to apply for the old age pension. But even as an old age pensioner, he did not give up. His political activism continued. He now moved to an argument that said we need Aboriginal voices in decision making. And he drew from what he saw from New Zealand. In New Zealand, the Maori have guaranteed seats in the Parliament. And Cooper saw this and began petitioning for the same right in Australia. In fact, in 1938, a particularly memorable year, he decided to go to the top. He petitioned King George V, saying it was time for the monarch to intervene on our behalf and ensure representation for Indigenous people in the Parliament. But he wasn't just content to write petitions and letters and make speeches. He decided it was time that Indigenous people organised. So he was a founding member and soon the secretary of the Australian Aborigines League. And he suggested that the League pursue not just Aboriginal rights, but a form of self-sufficiency, which he described as our own ameliorative effort for our own race. So we think sometimes about the protest of 1988 at the bicentenary about Aboriginal sovereignty, but in 1938, on the 26th of January 1938, to mark 150 years of British colonisation, Cooper organised a day of mourning. This photo is from Melbourne. And this was done across Australia. The League that Cooper was the secretary of shared its objectives with a range of similar organisations in other states, including the Aborigines Progressive Association of New South Wales, which was a long way more extreme than Cooper. The secretary there, called Bill Ferguson, did not mince words. He said of the sesquicentenary, we have been protected for 150 years, and look what has become of us. It would be better for the authorities to turn a machine gun on us, he said. This was not Cooper's way. He didn't buy this argument. He remained a committed Christian, and he believed that all people were equal before God and that that was the basis of demanding rights, that the rights of one belonged to all. And as Lou mentioned, this meant if the rights of everybody matter, then it doesn't matter whether they're local, national or international. And in December 1938, Cooper led an Aboriginal protest against what was going on in Germany. He marched to the German consulate in Melbourne to protest against, and I quote, the cruel persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi government of Germany. And he drew parallels between the plight of the Jews in Europe and that of the first Australians, arguing, and I quote, while we are all indignant over Hitler's treatment of the Jews, we are getting the same treatment here, and we would like this fact duly considered. Such demonstrations were exceedingly rare. This was probably the only private protest against Kristallnacht anywhere in the world. It's extraordinary that William Cooper led this protest in Melbourne. The German consulate, of course, refused to accept his petition, yet he thought it was crucial that Aboriginal voices were heard protesting against oppression on the other side of the planet. An extraordinary, brave act. In the writings of William Cooper, in a voice that speaks through all those petitions and letters and public addresses, there's a couple of recurring themes that will come back and back in Indigenous policy conversation. There's a concern with identity. There's the pull of assimilation, yet an equal determination to remain Aboriginal. There's engagement with wider politics, but a recognition that very few non-Indigenous are listening. A product of the missions, which Cooper once described as our best friends, he outlined a political program that sought recognition within the political framework imposed on Aboriginal Australia. Themes that will reoccur again and again in the conversation. I want to turn then to the second moment, which is the referendum campaign of 1967. Because in his many appeals to authority, William Cooper stressed the need for the law to reflect the professed Australian value of the fair go. The ideal of equality should be expressed by the next generation of Indigenous leaders became a campaign for legal reform. That campaign began in 1958 in Adelaide, a meeting of activists who created something called the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. And they advocated the removal of discrimination in national, state and territory law, along with equality of pay and access to traditional lands. And over the next decade, this Federal Council would campaign for a national referendum to secure constitutional change. They collected 100,000 signatures. 100,000 Australians signed petitions in favour of a referendum, which they presented to the federal parliament. They lobbied politicians, and ultimately they persuaded the Liberal government of Harold Holt to announce a referendum on 27 May 1967. By any means, any accounting, this was an extraordinarily successful campaign. 90% of Australians voted to change sections 51 and 127 of the Constitution and so count Aboriginal Australians in the census population and allow federal laws on Aboriginal matters to override state legislation. Political support for the referendum was so strong, for the yes vote was so strong, that no parliamentarian could be found to sponsor or write the no case that went out in the brochure that normally went out before a referendum. The yes case spoke not just to the constitutional issue, but to wider community concern about discrimination. Think of the Yakalala Bark petition of 1963, highlighting concerns in Arnhem Land. Think about the community concern that came in 1965 from the Freedom Ride, the bus tour of New South Wales country towns led by Charles Perkins and other Sydney University students. This was announced as a fact-finding expedition to survey Aboriginal living conditions, but it soon made clear to a wider public the racism in rural communities. There were street confrontations between students and town residents, particularly in Walgett, where the local RSL excluded Aboriginal ex-servicemen, and in Moree, where the council-run swimming pool excluded Aboriginal children. So this is a historic photo because it showed things changed. Perkins would later reflect about the humiliation of discrimination, about not being able to sit down at a restaurant, a delicatessen, if a white person wanted a seat, not being allowed to sit down, having to only take food away, not being served in a bar in a hotel, not being able to sit in the back seats of picture theatres, all of which he said were true in contemporary Walgett. And Walgett, he said, was Australia all over. And he attributed the beginning of social change for Aboriginal people in Australia to the 1967 referendum campaign that followed. This sense of discrimination needing to be addressed also inspired the activist Faith Bandler. She was the secretary of the Federal Council and a leading voice in the 1967 referendum campaign. And the law must change, she argued, to free Aboriginal people from the tyranny of state law. And she later recalled what it was like not being allowed to cross state boundaries, having to actually register if you moved across the boundary from New South Wales into Queensland. There was a great need to abolish those state laws and to bring everyone together under the common law, she said. So by voting yes, she argued, Australians could make the National Parliament responsible for a program of equal rights and equal opportunity. And that's an aspiration that was mirrored by Chicka Dixon, a leading Aboriginal activist who was then the president of the Sydney organisation, the Foundation for Aboriginal Affairs. For most Aborigines, he said, the referendum is basically and most importantly a matter of seeing white Australians finally, after 179 years, affirming that we believe, that they believe, that we are human beings. The mood within the Indigenous policy community that had been so galvanised by the referendum turned quite quickly to disillusionment. Those who pressed for constitutional change felt afterwards that it achieved very little. The Aboriginal activist and poet Kath Walker concluded that she and others had proved, and I quote, mere stooges of the white Australians working in the interest of white Australians, and that the referendum had simply eased the guilty conscience of white Australians. But Walker had been absolutely passionate about this referendum. She'd been active in the campaign. She was the Queensland State Secretary of the Federal Council. She was a lobbyist. She was an eloquent voice for change. She travelled to Canberra to press the constitutional case with then Prime Minister Robert Menzies, and there she is on the left. When the Prime Minister, just after this photo, invited the delegation into his office for a drink, Kath Walker noted pointedly that he could go to jail in Queensland for offering her alcohol. She began with huge hope that the referendum would make a difference, that change was possible. In an early poem, she wrote, "Brood no more on the bloody past that has gone without regret, but look to the light of happier days that will shine for your children yet." Yet in the years that followed the referendum, she reflected on her experience of political engagement with non-Indigenous Australia. She decided to move away from society, to land on North Stradbroke Island. Later she decided to abandon her European name in favour of Oodgaroo and her tribal name Nunakal. In a later lecture on black history in the 70s, she would conclude, despite a good start, the optimism had gone. The hopes had been dashed, only the dreadful problems remain. And in the same lecture, she would say, "My people face dispossession, disease and death. Despite the efforts of Aborigines and our white friends, our future is grim." So in the conversations around the 1967 referendum, we see familiar strands. An aspiration to reshape political arrangements, the use of legal concepts of equity and freedom from discrimination, but also an emerging despair that recognition doesn't change the game. In later work, Nunakal would embrace ideas of self-determination. Indeed, she'd start using the language of black liberation. No longer willing to work within white structures, she now sought a resurgent identity for Aboriginal Australia, reflected perhaps most famously in her 1969 poem called The Black Commandments, which start with "Thou shalt gather thy scattered people together," and finish with "Thou shalt be black for all the rest of thy days." And this very tough-minded view about what it meant to be Aboriginal came to the surface in the 1970s, after the disappointments of the referendum. Charles Perkins recalled vividly the frustration caused by the refusal of the federal government, and I quote here, to implement the spirit of the referendum. And the result, he suggested, was an assertion of black dignity, often labelled in the media as black power. And this strand of thinking would also now recur through the conversations that followed, a reminder of one of the choices open to black Australia. And it perhaps found its most memorable expression in the Tent Embassy of 1972. Nunakal's injunction to be black all the rest of thy days spoke to a sense that the government had failed to honour then Prime Minister Billy McMahon's promise to, and I quote, "end racial discrimination in our minds." It was time, suggested some activists, for more direct action. For Kevin Gilbert, this led to the formation of the Black Panther movement in Queensland. For Gary Foley, and I quote, Aboriginal control of Aboriginal affairs became the slogan of a newly emerging, homegrown Black Power movement. But the immediate trigger was a 1972 Australia Day announcement by Prime Minister McMahon that the government would not recognise Aboriginal land rights, but instead offer 50-year general purpose leases on lands occupied by Indigenous Australians, conditional on their using the land in economic terms. And a group in Redfern of young men, young Turks, who were calling themselves the Black Caucus, were so outraged they decided to send 4 young men, Michael Anderson, Billy Craigie, Bert Williams and Tony Corey, to set up a protest on the lawns of Parliament House in Canberra. So they got in a car and they drove to Canberra. They had only a beach umbrella with them, later a single tent. And Paul Coe, recalling us later, says, Tony Corey got the idea of calling the tent the Aboriginal Embassy, which started as a joke but turned out to be perhaps one of the most brilliant symbolic forms of protest the country has ever seen. And Tony Corey explained, the Prime Minister's statement had effectively declared us aliens in our own land. If so, we wanted an embassy like all the other aliens. In Gary Foley's memory, and I quote, the idea of the protest was originally simply to stage a small demonstration and be arrested. The hope was that the media would take photos before the men were dragged away, which is what happened. And the international scandal that followed caused serious political embarrassment for the McMahon government. In fact, in May of that year, the Prime Minister moved a new law making it illegal to camp on the grounds of Parliament. And Gary Foley again remembers, and I quote, within 20 minutes of the new ordinance coming into effect, ACT police moved on the embassy and forcibly removed the tents in the midst of a brawl in which 9 protesters were arrested and many more were injured. These arrests were televised around the nation and the globe. Within days, more than 2,000 people marched on Parliament House and re-erected the embassy. For Charles Perkins, the tent embassy was a really important focal point. And he said, no politician could go into Parliament House without turning around and looking at the embassy and saying, them bloody blacks, they're still there. A very similar point was made by the political activist Roberta Sykes. She emphasised the importance of black activism. She described the tent as, quote, that ragged little symbol of hope, an act that showed, or an act that said to white Australia, you've kicked us down for the last time. Nearly half a century later, the tent embassy remains on the parliamentary lawns. It's regularly repainted with slogans that express distance and isolation. It's a vivid reminder and a vivid symbol of a strand of Aboriginal thinking about how to address political convictions, an ironic use of international diplomacy to make a domestic point. The inspiration for the Redfern activists who set up the tent embassy had been a government decision on land rights, and this long-standing but unresolved agenda would become the key concern for the next generation of Indigenous thinking. Eventually, of course, a concern that was played out in the High Court in direct line of sight of the tent embassy on the lawn of the Parliament. But the campaign for native title is the next great conversation that happens in Indigenous Australia. Of course, the campaign for land rights begins right on at colonisation. Soon after the settlement of Melbourne in 1834, Wurundjeri leader William Barak pressed the manager of the Coranderrk mission, quote, give us this ground and let us manage ourselves and no one over us. We will show the country we can work it and we can make it pay. I know we will. But then, as later, few listened. For many Aboriginal leaders, land rights became the best option for restoring identity and creating a sustainable future. As activist Alice Briggs argued, the only answer is to give them back their land and let the Aborigine try and rectify what the white man has done. Others can rehearse much more eloquently than I the long legal fights over land rights, though we just heard a song about that long case. Lou and I did not conspire, but I'll show you why it looks that way in a minute. The cause seemed lost in 1971. The Gove case clearly saw the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory reject the idea of Aboriginal title and claim terra nullius as the prevailing legal doctrine. And this decision created an immediate dynamic, both disappointment but a complete new determination to test this through legal means. It should have been apparent from the Gove land rights case, said Kevin Gilbert, that blacks could not rely on the law as it stood, and so the campaign began for change. But it's not an argument that fell entirely on official indifference. Elected as Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam moved swiftly to change the law. As Noel Pearson said in his moving elegy of Whitlam, without this old man, the land and human rights of our people would never have seen the light of day. And as you heard Lou sing, Whitlam handed the title back to the Gurindji people in 1975, pouring a handful of red soil into Vincent Lingari's hands to symbolise the legal transfer. And in the same year, the Parliament considered the Racial Discrimination Act and debated a bill to implement recommendations on land rights from the Woodward Royal Commission. This was a major shift in the discussions. These are actions made possible by the 1967 referendum. So they showed that change in the law did matter. And although the second bill didn't pass, it was reintroduced under Malcolm Fraser as the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, and it allowed legal title in the Northern Territory if claimants could prove evidence of traditional association with the land. Yet these changes did not guarantee Indigenous ownership. The legal regime was tested in 1980 when mining exploration rights were approved by the Northern Territory government over sacred land at the Nookambah station. And you know the story that followed. When Indigenous people spoke up in protest, a convoy of mining and police vehicles from Perth arrived on the property. A blockade and clash followed with huge implications for the campaigns that would follow. It seems to me the land rights campaign echoes directly themes from William Cooper, a demand that Aboriginal property be returned to its original owners, linked to a claim of universal rights. In his case against the state of Queensland, a case that would change fundamentally the law, Eddie Mabo summed up recent Indigenous experience. My family has occupied the land here for hundreds of years before Captain Cook was born. They're now trying to say that I cannot own it. The present Queensland government is a friendly enemy of the black people, as they like to give you the Bible and take away your land. We should stop calling them boss. We must be proud to live in our own palm leaf houses like our fathers before us. It would take 10 years of legal fight, but Eddie Mabo, Sam Parsi, David Parsi, Salula Mapo, Surly and James Rice won their claim for ownership of lands in the Murray Islands. The 1992 High Court decision in the case of Mabo rejected the notion of terra nullius. With this decision and with the 1996 WIC ruling that followed, these were the fundamental decisions, but they didn't necessarily get received with universal acclaim within Indigenous communities. Michael Mansell, for example, contended that the court did not overturn anything of substance, but merely propounded white domination and superiority. So, an early test for the land rights regime came in 1994, when the Yorta Yorta people submitted a claim for native title. 9 years later, Justice Olney ruled that, and I quote, the tide of history had washed away any acknowledgement of traditional laws or real observance of traditional customs by the applicants. As Monica Morgan reflected on the case, our mob knew we were taking a chance, trusting the system of the white man, but this is like an annihilation of our culture. Land rights remain the subject of continuing conversation across Indigenous Australia. An appeal to the form of community proposed by William Barak, self-reliance on Indigenous lands, with Indigenous people deciding how much to engage with other forms of political and community life. This is an argument of self-determination made possible through legal title. It's an unresolved aspiration for many Indigenous communities, but its influence is clear in the final conversation I'd like to touch on, the talk of empowerment for Aboriginal Australia. It's a hard cartoon to see, I know. Essentially, it's a report from the 19th century and a report from the late 20th century. In each case, the person handing down the report says, well, here's the report, something's got to change about alcoholism and domestic violence and child neglect and diet and hygiene and housing and imprisonment and despair. The point being, you can hand down the same report at any time over a century. The last century has seen a troubling history of Indigenous advancement, with very slow recognition of legal rights and an end to formal discrimination. Aboriginal Australians were finally citizens after 1967 and sometimes beneficiary of the return of native lands from the 1970s. Yet Aboriginal communities remain marked by widespread poverty and the social ills that travel with grave disadvantage, from poor health outcomes to violence. As in 1967, winning recognition of native title was followed by disillusionment. Why did land rights not make Indigenous communities more viable, better places to live? Why in much of remote Australia are services and outcomes still so far below acceptable national standards? And most importantly, what is to be done? These are the questions that dominate contemporary Aboriginal conversations, at least the conversations accessible to we non-Indigenous. Not surprisingly, the analysis of what's the problem varies wildly. Pat Dodson has been unambiguous about the causes of Indigenous disadvantage. Speaking after the 2007 Northern Territory intervention, he spoke angrily about white assumptions about community. This human tragedy, he said, is caused by decades of underinvestment by government in capital and social infrastructure. It's an explanation that lays the blame squarely for dysfunctional Indigenous communities on history and neglect, and it demands government address underinvestment and so turn around disadvantage. But not everybody buys that argument about cause and effect. Other voices look to quite different analysis and solutions. In her 2012 Boyer Lectures, The Quiet Revolution, Marcia Langton welcomed prospects for greater Indigenous self-reliance. She pointed to the mining boom happening on Aboriginal lands, and she put the case for more Indigenous enterprises, employment and mutual support. She described the Gumala Indigenous Construction Resource Group, for example, in the East Pilbara, where over 60% of the workforce on a mining site is Indigenous. And she wrote, the wages paid increase Indigenous incomes and distribute the incomes to Indigenous families, enable them to accumulate assets such as homes and to invest in the education of their children. Paul mentioned Noel Pearson's speech last year here, a very similar argument in his speech. After leading the Cape York Land Council from 1990, Pearson shifted his focus to community development and he eventually founded the Cape York Partnerships Program. As he argued in his 2014 quarterly essay, Radical Hope, the only path to closing socio-economic gap is for Indigenous Australians to become active agents in their own development. And this builds on his 2005 Blueprint for Cape York, which promoted personal and community responsibility for everybody. Pearson attributes this thinking both to talking to the elders in the communities that he works in and to the philosophy of the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen. In his aim, and I quote, that Cape York people have the capabilities to choose the life they have reason to value. It's an aspiration captured in the slogan of the Cape York's partnership program, responsibility, opportunity, freedom. This is a rejection of further government intervention and intrusion in Indigenous lives. Pearson argues that passive welfare destroys the basis of a strong individual, self-belief, self-reliance, reasons to try. He wants to break the welfare dependency of Indigenous communities and instead encourage work, education and an economic development so there are jobs for people. It's a vision which creates much debate inside Indigenous Australia. Yet the Pearson agenda for an empowered community taking responsibility for its own fate has resonance close to home. It's the theme of a March 2015 report in which 8 Indigenous communities decided to embrace a similar partnership approach to empower their communities. And though the report is recent, the aspiration to build skills and confidence amongst Indigenous communities has a very long history, and nowhere is it better exemplified than here in the Rumballara Football and Netball Club. This organisation can trace its origins back more than 40 years, but in truth it has deep historic connections with the football teams of the local reserve from the 1890s in the Kamarunja. The Rumballara Club has mirrored Indigenous history in so many ways, being regularly locked out of the district league at various times despite its sporting prowess, but always battling for the right to play and represent its members. And this club is just one of many organisations fostered and led by Yorta Yorta elder Paul Briggs. And Paul is a modest man, but in a fabulous piece of writing, I can quote him, "We are faced with assimilation if we don't develop an economic vision and strategies for our collective futures." Assimilation means not being here, not having an identity. Assimilation means loss of language. It means loss of self-respect. It's everything that Paul is fighting so hard against. So his focus has been on creating Indigenous institutions that provide Aboriginal people with skills and experience necessary to prosper. And it's no surprise that this program is represented in the Empowered Communities, Empowered Peoples Report, a document that brings together some of these long-standing conversations amongst Indigenous voices. Its author set out 2 primary ambitions: to close the gap and to enable cultural recognition. This is the pathway, suggests Paul and those who support empowered communities, to thrive in the realities of contemporary Australia and yet to convey Indigenous heritage, goals that might have been welcomed by William Cooper or William Burake. So let me draw this to a close. Few policy debates are linear, building carefully on experience and evidence to arrive at consensus about next steps. That's not how politics works in any community. In most conversations, the topic wanders, new voices arise, others depart, and people bring their own assumptions to the discussion, their experience of the world, their own language, their local concerns. Since 1938, the policy conversation within Aboriginal Australia has explored many pathways, but often returned to a small number of central concerns. These arise from the necessity to reimagine identity. For William Cooper, the answers were clear, if very difficult to secure: land to sustain viable communities, political rights through parliamentary representation, protection under laws that apply to all, values of equality and dignity that Cooper first encountered amongst the missionaries of his youth. For the generation of 1967, legal equality shaped the conversation, with an expectation that government programs should follow. But as bright promise gave way to disappointing reality, a rhetoric of separation and self-determination came to the fore. A new generation evaluated the prospects for Indigenous Australia, with the demonstrations of the era, the angry publications, the tent embassy, even the Aboriginal flag designed in 1971 by Harold Thomas for the land rights movement, came new language, new symbols, which are now integrally part of Indigenous dialogue. All these concerns flowed into a renewed conversation about native title from the 1970s, and here old concerns met new: identification with traditional lands, aspirations to escape dependence on non-Indigenous institutions, and more recently, the prosperity possible for some through mining and tourism. Here is both concern for the consequences of welfare in Indigenous community and a desire to build Indigenous capabilities. These are just a few of the black voices and concerns in an ongoing conversation, a rich and important conversation among Indigenous Australians. The concerns expressed in 1938 remain part of the discussion, adding to the experiences of referendum and protest and land rights and community. When Indigenous people discuss policy, they affirm the importance of ideas and debate. The active discussion is a contribution to identify, a willingness to confront the world and shape the future. To talk is to call into being the disappointments of the present, the challenging road to the future. For as Northern Territory politician Marion Scrimray said recently, Aboriginal people have never been afraid of having the hard conversation. Thank you.